Well, welcome to 2020, right? Like it felt like just yesterday we were doing the whole Y2K thing. 5 years ago we all put our 5-year plans in motion for the year 2020. At least I was told I should. But here we are. So we're glad you're with us, and you're glad that you're spending this morning here at Life Community Church. I have a question, because I think that this is a common thing. I think that most people are sort of similar to me in this regard. I have a hard time learning my lessons, okay? I repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Thank you, yes. I think you do too, right? But we hesitate to sort of admit that. It makes us feel foolish or weak or whatever. But it's sort of like the January thing to do, right, is to make resolutions. And almost always our resolutions for the new year, and now we're talking about our resolutions for a new decade, they're almost always tied to things that we've maybe built patterns in our life that we have a hard time, breaking those patterns or getting through those things or changing those things up. Sometimes we feel like Charlie Brown, going to kick the ball, and Lucy pulls it away on him. You have to be a certain age to know that reference, right? Sometimes maybe we feel like fans of a football team that always gets the SEC refs. It's too soon for some, maybe? I don't know. Even this week, actually, it was back 2 weeks ago, it coincided with the release of the new Star Wars movie, okay? So sorry if you've got Star Wars fatigue. I've got another little anecdote here for you. Actually, right here in town at Ohio State, there was research that was conducted, okay? It was published just this past December, but the research goes back 2 years to 2017. And what happened was they actually asked a significant sample size of people before the 8th Star Wars movie, so the one that came out in 2017, they asked a significant sample size of people to measure 3 weeks before the movie came out, those who were anticipating to see the movie, they asked them about their expectations. What did they expect? Did anybody see this story? So they asked them to rate their expectation level in certain areas, and they found lots of things with those expectations, but then they actually followed up with those people 3 weeks after the movie had come out, and the people who had seen the movie. And here's what they found. The people who had rated the movie highest on their expectations came out of it the least satisfied, right? And the people who had gone in with more modest expectations came out with higher levels of satisfaction, right? Now, there's many things that we could say about this, and again, we sort of joke about it around here from time to time with Star Wars and it being like a side religion for many people, okay? But there's something about us that we go into experiences with heightened levels of expectation. And I think we would say that over time, and in many of those cases, if you're like me, you sort of feel like I've gone in with heightened levels of expectation, and the experience or the encounter or whatever it was I was hoping it was going to produce for me, it didn't live up to the hype. It didn't meet my expectations. And it's a pattern that we find ourselves in. It's a routine that we get stuck in. And so what we're going to do, okay, is we're going to talk about the patterns in our life and the expectations that we build and what we think may be going on. And Dan mentioned this at the start of the service, if you were here with us. We're starting a series called In the Company of Kings. This series is going to be a look at a particular section of the Scriptures. It's a fairly long narrative section. It's the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's 2 books in the Old Testament that tell the story of the children of Israel as they moved from being a people with, we could look at it even just as a political thing, a people governed in a certain way, that they then moved to a monarchy. But there's a lot going on in the narrative, and we're going to take an extended look at this section of the Scriptures over the next several months here. We're going to be doing this through the rest of the winter and the spring, because we believe that in this narrative, God's going to show us things about the patterns in our life. He's going to show us things about what we should be expecting from him. And he doesn't just come right out and give us a bulleted list. He gives us stories. He gives us stories about people. And today we're going to look at sort of a prelude to that. But here's the section of the scriptures a little bit of a historical background, the section of the scriptures that 1st and 2nd Samuel, the books of the Old Testament, here's the section of the scriptures that it covers and the time period that it covers. It covers roughly 100 years of history, okay? It covers about 100 years of history. When the book starts, there's a man named Samuel who's born towards the very beginning. The book is named after him. He clearly couldn't have written it because it goes on after his death, okay? I think it's probably named after him because he's the first significant character at the outset of the book. It goes on, and it goes on to the first king of Israel. His name was King Saul. And then it really, most of the narrative of it, probably about 2/3 of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, which were originally one book, the book of Samuel, that's been split into two for our convenience. But 2/3 of that narrative deals with King David. And we probably know David pretty well from legend, right? This is David and Goliath, okay? This is King David, David and Bathsheba. This is the king that was sort of the archetype, or he was the model for all the kings who came after him for the Jewish people. But what I'm going to do is I want to kind of pull back a little bit historically. But think about this for a minute. This whole book is going to cover 100 years of history. So again, first Sunday of 2020. Think about how long 100 years is. We'll go through this in a few months. But think about how long 100 years is. 100 years ago in the United States, right? No television. We were at the outset of air travel, okay? That's 100 years. In fact, 100 years ago was the suffrage movement. Women were given the right to vote in the U.S. It's only been that long, okay? And think of where we are now 100 years later. So we're going to look at this 100-year span, but if we pull it back even further and look at a broader stretch, these books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, they occur in a historical context. And immediately before, there's this period called the Judges, and we're going to come back to that in just a minute because that's where we're going to focus today, is what do we learn about the stories that come right before the big story we're going to look at. But then what comes immediately after the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel is King Solomon. And again, he's renowned for his wisdom, and he built the temple, and he did all these great things. He was the wisest king. But then after Solomon, it divides, the nation divides, and they go into exile. And there's about two 400-year periods that bracket either side of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And if we pull it back even further, okay? We find that prior to the book of Judges, you have this long period of time in the history of the Jewish people where they were in Egypt. They were in bondage at the end of that, but they went to Egypt willingly, and they wound up becoming slaves. That's a 400-year span of time, and it's one slice of this. Prior to that, the patriarchs Abraham and his descendants. After the time of the kings in Israel and the divided nation, you have what's called the Second Temple period, a little short period where they come back and they build a new temple. And then after that, the writings of the Old Testament, the writings of the Hebrew Bible just go silent. Okay, they're called silent years until Christ is born. Our calendar's a little off, roughly 5 BC. Okay? But this 2,000-year span of Jewish history recorded for us. And one thing that's just fascinating to me is what we're going to look at. If you just keep your eyes kind of on this timeline, what we're going to look at is right smack dab in the center of the history of God's work through the Israelites, through a family that became a nation. What we're going to look at is this period of time, and we're going to spend our time looking at what goes on in there. Dan said this earlier, but we're going to ask questions about kings and what deserves to wear a crown in our lives. What does it look like for us to submit to authorities, whether they be just or unjust? We're going to ask those questions. But today, okay, today's a prelude. It's a prelude. So you see that big, wide span there? That's actually what I get to cover in the next 30 minutes. Okay? We're going to spend 5 months on the chunk, 4 or 5 months on the chunk on the right. And this morning, we're going to cover the chunk on the left. So I'll do my best. Okay? But if you've got a Bible, in just a minute, we're going to turn to the book of Judges. It's in the Old Testament. And I'll put the passage up here. But we're going to look at the book of Judges. And we're going to look at chapter 3, a section in chapter 3. And as you turn there, I want to just say we're going to focus on this period of history just to set up what comes next. Okay? Just to set up what comes next. The book of Judges, obviously, is this plural form of the word judge. And there was this string of judges. These were people in the nation of Israel who served sort of a half political, half military position. They were they were kind of non-religious. Like they didn't serve a religious function. Those were the priests. The judges sort of acted as, in some ways, like a de facto government and led a de facto military. The word judge that in the Hebrew Bible actually comes, that we translate as judge, actually comes from this idea of a vindicator, so of being vindicated. And so a judge specifically in this context is someone who sort of vindicates or takes God's revenge for his people. They weren't elected. Usually it says that God appointed them, though there are times where people tried to manipulate and become a judge on their own. Those didn't end well. Okay? I want to say, too, though, these people are not heroes in the sense of folks that we ought to look at and admire their actions and follow in their path. Not all the time. It's a mixed bag. There's famous ones like Gideon, and he's someone who has some attributes that, yes, we could look at and say, absolutely. And then there's Samson, right, who is this debacle of a human being. But God used him to vindicate, to bring the people back to him. Sometimes there are 13 judges recorded in the book, and some of them take chapters and chapters to tell their story, and then some of them are like Tola and Jair, okay? I'm just going to read this for you from Judges chapter 10. It says, after Abimelech, there arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Puah, son of Dodo. We don't have good names anymore. Son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim, and he judged Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried at Shamir. 23 years of history in 5 lines. It goes on. After him arose Jair, the Gileadite, who judged Israel 22 years. And he had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. Is that each? I'm assuming it's 1 donkey per son. And they had 30 cities called Havorth Jair to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And Jair died and was buried at Kamon. So sometimes you get a Gideon in the story. Sometimes you get a Samson, big, long story, drawn out, and we get lots of details. And sometimes you get Tola and Jair in the book of Judges, okay? And we get this picture of these judges that served as God's hand. They served as God's agent to lead the people, to guide the people. And what we're going to do, actually, if you have a Bible and you want to turn to Judges chapter 3, if not, I'm going to put this up here. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at one short story about a judge. It's a little longer than those, but it's certainly not nearly as long as some others. And we're going to ask ourselves about some things about this period of time. And it's in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. Verses 7 through 11, Judges chapter 3. And just read it with me if you would. It says, and the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord, their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was on him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand. And his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim, so the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Okay? Here's an entire cycle. It tells us it was about 40 years that Othniel was the judge. Okay? 40 years in just a few lines of text. I'll turn 45 this year. I know, I don't look it, okay? Don't look a day over 50, okay? But But 40 years of their history is summed up in this little section. And what it does for us, though, is it tells us, it gives us just a sliced look at something that happened here, and it happened over and over with the nation. And it's that they were in a cycle, okay? They were in a cycle. It was a cycle that just kind of kept repeating itself. And we look at the story of Othniel because this story of Othniel actually gives us insight into all the pieces of this cycle in one little chunk. So let's take a look back through it and see a couple things that emerge. Look at this. Look at the very first part of that again, verse 7. It says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Okay? Now, we'll say more about this in a few minutes, but they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and it says they served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. These were foreign gods. These were the gods of the land. When the Israelites, when God gave them the land and sent them into the land, they were commanded, they were told to drive the people out, wipe out the inhabitants of the land, and they were given a reason for it, lest you become like them and worship their gods. Their gods were the Baals and the Ashtoreth. These were pagan gods that demanded heavy human sacrifice. They demanded prostitutes. They demanded all kinds of things that were impure, unclean, all kinds of things that you would not find in the nation of Israel. You would not find allowed by the scriptures. And so when they were sent in, they were told to drive out the people from the land. Otherwise, what would happen is they would wind up serving those foreign gods. Okay? And here we are. That was primarily the book of Joshua, and here in Judges that command still remained. But here we are in the very earliest chapters of this book of Judges. And it tells us something. It says that they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord. They forgot. You see what happens, and this is the first step of this cycle. What happened with the nation of Israel is that they began to drift, right? It says, we kind of like look at forgetting as just sort of an accident. Like, I didn't mean it, I just forgot. But the book of Judges, and the scriptures in particular, are going to tell us something about this word forgot. They're going to bring more of our intent to the table. Now, it's sort of intent by omission, right? Like, I didn't remember to remember, I forgot. And what happens and what we see is there's a drift that begins. There's a movement that starts to take place. I grew up in the South, and I grew up in a particular branch of the church where we talked a lot about backsliding, okay? And we worried about backsliding. And in some ways, we've kind of lost some of that language, right? We've lost the idea that it's possible for me to be moving away from God, sliding, drifting in a direction that's drawing me away from my God. But that's what we see here. By the way, it is the natural impulse of humanity. Let's just get in the water with me, okay? It's the perfect temperature for us. The problem is it gets hotter and hotter all the time, but we'll say more about that in a minute, okay? But this is just what we do. We just sort of go about life. And drifting is what happens when we just sort of do what's next. And we don't focus. We don't take the time and expend the energy to actually remember God. The people were drifting. They had forgotten. And in their forgetting God, they began to worship the idols of the land. Now, we don't necessarily erect temples to these gods, although we may. Our gods of entertainment have temples that we've built. Okay? We've now even brought them into our homes. We sort of worship there. It's just the temple of the land. The temple, the god of greed and consumption. It has temples. And we make sacrifices there. And we just sort of justify our indulgence in these things by sort of saying it's just kind of what everyone does. It's just the natural flow of things. It's just the way things are. That's the drift talking. It is. When we just simply indulge our flesh, when we simply chase after more and more consumption, when we do those things, we're just in the drift. And the drift can go on for a long time. It can go on for quite a while. But let's take a look at the next section of this passage, verse 8. It says, "Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years." Okay? So see what happens. See what happens. There's a therefore in this. The people forgot, and they did the thing. The reason God told them to remember was so that they would not indulge, not engage with the gods of the land. But they forget, and they do. Therefore, because of that, this stirs something with God. Okay? It stirs something with God. And God actively, it says, actively hands them over to a foreign invader. He actively hands them over to the king of another land, and they serve him. You see, what happens is as we drift, there's punishment, or maybe we prefer the word consequence. We use consequence to sort of refer to a punishment that's just the natural result of our choices. But it is what it is. We serve these gods. We serve the gods of our flesh. We serve the gods of our culture. And we wind up in a place where what we thought was we were going to master them. We thought we were going to have control over them. They wind up controlling us. And they become our king. And so we thought that we could handle a little bit of indulging our flesh. And the next thing you know, we're in a sex-saturated, pornography-centered, indulgent world. And we're serving it. We thought we could handle our money. We thought we were in control of it. And what we find out is that we made it a god. We've idolized it. And now it controls us. We wind up serving it. And we work ourselves to the bone because we have to have more, or it makes us feel secure. The idol, the god, has become the foreign invader. It's moved into our life, and now it controls us. You see, it's the same pattern that the children of Israel went through. They worship the foreign gods, and God says, okay, this is what it's like. This is what happens when you choose the foreign god over me, some other god rather than me. And it's the same thing that we do. But that's not all, right? Verse 9. But, there's a big but here. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, more to say about that, what happens next. Notice what they did. It was 8 years, by the way. 8 years they served that foreign god. If the service began today, we wouldn't be crying out to God until 2028, which I'm still convinced is never coming. Okay? But the people did cry out to God. You see, there's this cycle that went on in the book of Judges where there was a drift from God, and then God's hand of punishment or consequence moved in. And then the people would wake up and realize, how did we get here? We serve Yahweh. We serve the God of all gods, the King of all kings. And they would repent. They would cry out to God. This has got to be our move too, right? It's the same thing we ought to do. It involves a confession of serving that false god, but then a move away from, tearing down the temples and the idols that we've built. Now, I'm not suggesting that we, storm CBS headquarters or whatever, or storm your local bank and tear it down. I don't think that's going to go well. But there are practical steps that we can take in our lives here at the beginning of a new decade to say, I no longer serve you. Cancel that subscription. Try it. Give more. rather than depending on the amount of money that I have in my savings for my security, willingly hand it to those who are in need and put more dependence on God, greater faith in him. We can take active steps. We can repent of these things. Get rid of, if there's a device that is a temptation to you, get rid of it. If there's a relationship in your workplace that is a problem for you, take active steps to move away from that person in whatever way that you can. So how much important is this? So much so that if it costs you your job, I don't think that that's a price too high to pay. Because if we don't take drastic steps, if we don't cry out to God and repent and turn, the thing that right now we think we have under control, we're going to wake up one day and it has control over us. And so repentance is necessary. It was always a part. Every time we see a cycle of the judges, the 13 times in the book, every time we see this pattern at work, and every time the people repented before these next verses. It picks up there in the middle of the verse, but it says, the Lord raised up a deliverer, a judge, a vindicator for the people of Israel, who saved them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was on him, and he judged Israel. He vindicated Israel. He went out to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over him. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Okay? You see, what happens is we drift. We drift. That drift leads to consequence. But when we cry out, there's deliverance. Do we believe, and this is an honest to goodness question, do we believe that we serve a God who delivers us when we cry out to him? And I have to say, I'm not sure that I do. Because right where I started, I make the same mistakes over and over again. I tell half-truths when honesty, full honesty, would just serve me better. And I don't know why. I withhold kindness to others when I'm certain that they need it. And I've got it. God's blessed me in ways I've got it to give. I don't know why. I lose my temper. I lose my temper when people get in the way of what I'm trying to do here. Don't you know it's best for us? Family, coworkers. I lose my temper. When I know in my head, I've lived the pattern enough to know that the loss of my temper is not going to solve the problems. It's only going to heighten them and make them worse. It's only going to bring about consequences that I really don't want to have to deal with. But I find myself in the midst of it all the time. You see, I'm living in this cycle over and over and over again. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Let's take a look at a couple things, okay? Let's say this, that these patterns, okay? These patterns and cycles in our life, they create downward spirals. You see, it's tough to illustrate this just as it is, okay? It's tough to illustrate this on just a two-dimensional surface. But this is the very next verse. We read verses 7 through 11 of Judges chapter 3. And Othniel is 40 years of peace. And then look at verse 12 in chapter 3 and what it says there. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay? Again. So they go right back into this pattern. 40 years, and there's a drift. And who could hardly blame them after 40 years, right? Like, I can't remember what I did wrong this morning. And 40 years later, they begin to drift, and it starts over again. And we see it again. But here's the thing. And this is the point we want to make. That's one cycle. But then there's another right after it, and a couple more, and a couple more. And by the time it's all said and done, there's this repeating cycle of cycles. And it's a downward spiral. It's a downward spiral. This is the reality of our lives. In the long view, it's easy to say, well, that's just the way things are. It's just what happens. It's just kind of, like, a body at rest tends to stay at rest, okay? It's just how we operate. It's easy to say Things are the way they are, and they can't change. But here's the truth, and we've got to hang on to these things. Number one, God breaks cycles. The way things are is not the way they were meant to be, and it's not the way that they can be, and it certainly is not the way that God says it will be when he has full reign. Can you hear me on that? Just because we've experienced something so frequently does not mean that God defines it as normal. It's not normal. This cycle is not what God meant for us. It's our sin that creates it and sustains it and feeds it. And it doesn't just repeat over and over. It gets worse each time. So this is another point here, okay? Because this is another sort of maybe objection to this, but God asks for a difficult level of obedience. And it is essential that we just don't choose compromise. You see, this is what happens to the children of Israel, and it happens for us too. We're called to something. We're called to a faithful way of life that trusts God. We're called to say, when he speaks truth and right. And I don't have the option. I do have the option in action, but I ought not to give myself the option of questioning it or doubting it or renegotiating his terms. The thing God had asked them to do was very difficult. Go into the land and drive out the people, all of them. In fact, we might look at it with the lens of the 21st century and say, not only was it difficult, it's wrong for God to tell them to do that. But we forget an important piece of information when we start to accuse God. He knows more than we do. He's bigger than we are. He has a much larger understanding of the reality of the situation, their situation and my situation, a much greater understanding of it than even those of us in the midst of it right now could ever fathom. He sees what has happened, what's going on now, and what will happen. Not just what will happen based on what we actually do, but what will happen based on every possible outcome, based on every possible choice we could make. He knows. He sees. And you see, what happened with the children of Israel, he asked them to do something difficult, and up at the top there, they were half obedient. They went in and they pushed some people out and they left some there and they kind of made their own way. They to put it like one word to it, they compromised. And not compromise in sort of the tactical sense of making an agreement to live at peace. They compromised in that they didn't go the full distance with what God had asked them to do. It was half obedience. And that half obedience led to the adoption of these foreign gods and idolatry. And then as it goes on, as the cycle repeats and we get further into the book of Judges, we find that not just did the temples and the altars of the people were allowed to stay, but the children of Israel engaged in their practices. The children of Israel brought prostitutes into these temple places. They gave their own daughters over as sacrifice to these gods. The evil just ramped up. And it all started with sort of like a half obedience. And when you get to the end of the book of Judges, it actually leads to civil war. The nation, the people are ripped in half. One of the tribes is at war with the rest of them. And it created an environment where they were just, the word for it is disintegrated. They were meant to be a tribe of 12 integrated, or a nation of 12 integrated tribes, and they wound up separated and disintegrated. That's where it ends. And you see, this is the thing that's true for us. What starts with a very sensible half obedience, over time, for you and I, becomes more and more disobedient until ultimately we're kind of at war with ourselves. We wake up one day and go, who is living in my skin? Who is it that's doing these things? It can't be me. I can't possibly be at the center of these broken relationships. I can't possibly be the person who's engaged in these hidden behaviors that I just wish I wish weren't true, but somehow they are. I don't want to be at the end of this where I'm just so dishonest that how do you even know what the truth is anymore? But it's what happens to us when we just bow to this and say, this is the way it is. This is just the way it is. Because what we're going to spend time on, and we're going to see this, but we're going to spend time on, today we're looking at their failure, but we're going to spend time over the next several months on how God breaks the cycle. God breaks the cycle. It's what he does. It's what he does. Take a look at one more thing with me. So what do we do just today? How is the cycle broken? And the key to breaking the cycle is remembering what God has done. Okay? Did you see, this is back to chapter 3, verse 7. It says that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. You catch this? The key is to remember. Now, there's something fascinating about this. Again, we think about remembering as a cognitive activity, recalling information. What did you have for lunch yesterday? Don't worry about answering it, but what was the score of the game? What's that verse in the Bible? When's my anniversary? We think of remembering as a cognitive activity. It's April 25th, by the way. Right? Yeah, April 25th. All right. We think of remembering as a cognitive activity. It just happens in my head. For the Jewish people in the Hebrew language, it's not the case. Forgetting was an act of the will. It was a decision that was made that was embodied. It's why they set up piles of rocks and called them places of remembrance. It's why they established monuments. It's why even in the scriptures it says, write this above your door, so that as you go in and as you go out, you're going to see it every time. They actively were told to remember. They didn't. You see, and we're the same way. We're the same way. But what are we supposed to remember? So we see this cycle, right? And what's the first clue to breaking the cycle? What's the first clue to breaking the cycle? Well, the first thing is we can't forget what God has done for us. See, this is what the Israelites, this is the same thing that they did. God had rescued them from Egypt and brought them into the land by miraculous measures. It could only be said he did it. They didn't have the military might to win battles. They didn't have the resources that were necessary to take the land on their own. God gave it to them. And they began to forget those things. And so as we look at this pattern, this cycle, we've got to remember that in the midst of every piece of our lives, it's covered in God's grace. Can we begin to remember this? That even as I'm drifting from him, God's grace is covering me. Perhaps that second phase is even the hardest to accept this. Even when I'm in the midst of consequence or punishment, God, that is God's grace in my life, acting in my best interest. And as I cry out, I begin to see his grace. And he delivers, I'm experiencing his grace. But his grace pervades every aspect of my life. We've got to take steps to remember that, or we're doomed to live the cycle over and over and over again. The key to breaking the pattern of sin is the grace of God in my life. It's not trying harder. It's not working more. It's not feeling greater levels of guilt when I fail. It's remembering the goodness of God. The second thing is this. We have to remember, another thing to remember, just like Israel, and they were forgetting this, is that God is king. God is king. You see, the first part of the book of Judges, you almost never see the word king in relationship to Israel. It's almost always used to refer to the other lands, the lands around them. But as the book of Judges starts to near its end, you start to see these things. And it says, in those days, Judges chapter 17, in those days there was no king in Israel. There was no king. Chapter 18, in those days there was no king in Israel. Chapter 19, in those days there was no king in Israel. There was a certain Levite sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. The Levites were the priests. They were the tribe set aside for the holiest activities. And here he is taking on a young woman for his sexual pleasure. Their lack of forgetting was tied to this idea that they needed a king. And I put 19:1 there twice, sorry. Copy and paste fail. That last one is actually the last verse of the book of Judges, the very last verse. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You see, this is what happens. We forget the fact that God is king. We forget the fact that he ultimately is in charge and he reigns. And so we want to be people who remember. So we're going to sing a song here again as a prayer to God to say that you are our king. You're in charge. Would you stand with us and sing?